Hi there, thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. You can find out more at fantasy-animation.org, as well as via our social media channels on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. If you like what you see, then please do support the show by subscribing, liking and reviewing the show. A quick written review, 5 stars, would be really, really helpful. It helps make the visibility of the programme even more. It helps us reach more listeners and it helps justify what we're doing to our employers. So please take a minute out of your life to help the show. It would really help us create more content for you. Otherwise, sit back, relax and enjoy the latest episode. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
And today, Chris, it's time to return to a franchise that I'm pretty sure when we did the first instalment we said we'll do the next one soon. Well, if soon is an entire global pandemic away, then we're returning to The Two Towers.
Yes.
A film I really love. I think it's a bit divisive among Lord of the Rings fans, but I would go out on the limb and say it's my favourite of the three. So I'm excited to talk about it, and a film I've seen lots of times, and I'm sure it's the same for you, isn't it?
Well, I would say, given the length of this movie, there's a good chance I probably started watching this when we finished doing the Fellowship of the Ring. It's only just come to an end. So here we are, however many years later, and I've finally finished the final sequence of the film. So I was saying just before we came on, I'm not a Lord of the Rings aficionado in the same way that you or our very special guest are. So I'm going to be playing the role of Alex in this episode because I'm going to be wading through some characters and some settings. I think I said this when we did the first Lord of the Rings, is that I have been to these places in real life, and I have got on a boat and done some whitewater rafting down a lot of some of the. This is the tour guide in me speaking, going through all of these locations. So I'm interested in the kind of the use again of New Zealand to ground some of these visual effects, and actually I'm more interested in the rhetoric of animation beyond these kinds of. With regards to these movies, the ways in which they're renowned for the visual effects, but they work really hard to talk about how these actors fly to New Zealand and do things there on the ground. So I've got kind of some things to say about that, and then of course Gollum and motion capture and Andy Serkis and movement and performance and all that usual stuff. But I'm going to take a back seat certainly for this episode.
And for me, I've written on this film and I've watched it so many times. There's so many angles one could come at it that's probably one of the reasons we haven't done it yet. Is that it's where do we start? So I think we've got a great guest on to help us come at it from a slightly different angle, but a no less really interesting one. So yes, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Dan White, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Huddersfield, where he teaches on a variety of different topics in film music theory, screen studies, pop music studies, and aspects of music, gender, and identity. So people might see the theme as it's emerging. His work looks at music and world building in fantasy film franchises, and he has a book under contract with Routledge, which will be coming out soonish, on this topic, particularly in relation to Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. So you can see why we've got him on the show. So Dan, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this, and you've got some great guests already on the roster, so I'm very pleased to be part of them.
Well, we're pleased to have you. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yes, we're very pleased to have you on to help us unpack this behemoth in so many ways. That is The Two Towers. So, as listeners might have gleaned from your introduction, you've come at these films primarily from music and music theory, which is, I think, me and Chris, as kind of classic film studies people, we're very guilty at treating film silently quite often, right? And I think it's good that we think about this because the score of these movies is such an important part of why they resonate. So, I mean, other than those kind of obvious beats, what got you interested in thinking about music and world building in relation to the Lord of the Rings franchise more broadly, I guess?
Yeah, I think it comes largely from some of my sort of postgraduate and then PhD study. I was always interested in sort of film music and music in media more widely. And and quite liked the Lord of the Rings films. I think they're pretty good, and enjoyed watching them, and particularly enjoyed the music. And so, in terms of my own listening tastes, I was already quite familiar with Howard Shore's music for the three Lord of the Rings films, and started to look more deeply in a more analytical way in terms of kind of world building, how Howard Shore puts together quite a detailed and sort of complex web of interrelated themes for not just one film, but the kind of overarching trilogy of films, and just became really intrigued as to sort of how that worked. And some of the instances where it wasn't quite as sort of clear cut, it wasn't just sort of Mickey Mousing or just providing a theme whenever that character comes on the screen, but actually how some of those musical themes interrelated as well. So I suppose that's what kind of kicked off my interest in these particular films musically, because the music's pretty good, I think, and it's garnered a kind of a significant following, a significant fandom as well. The music and the scores and the extended kind of complete recordings as well. So looking at it from a fandom perspective as well is really interesting. People and how they kind of relate to this music, what role it plays for them in their lives. So yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm really interested in unpacking this with you. I mean, I'm no music expert. I don't suppose Chris is a music expert unless he's been hiding something from me from about 110 episodes. So we might be playing the Luddite role here, but I'm interested in some of the things you're saying there. That what I do know about it, or at least I've garnered from interviews with Howard Shore, is that one of the key things he was interested in doing is kind of playing with or using music as a mode of storytelling, or at least that's how he presents it to his to the listeners of these things, right? So if anyone is familiar with Lord of the Rings, I think one of the key aspects of the music is that almost each character or there's lots of leitmotifs going on in the score, right? And there's almost like, it can almost get parodic at occasion, where we have like, the scene with the two hobbits, we have one theme, the scene with the Fellowship, here's the Fellowship theme. And that seems to be the structuring force behind some of these movies. It sounds like you're interested in both looking at that more deeply and complicating it a little bit. And I was very interested in that term Mickey Mousing you just used, because I don't know what it means, and I reckon we're going to be interested in unpacking that a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, looking at the sort of the compositional aspect and the music of these particular films, music is quite clearly working in a number of ways. It is building the world, and that's what I'm sort of interested in first and foremost. So not just the musical ideas, but also the instruments that are being used, to an extent how they've been recorded, the production, the voices and the use of voice, even just the use of reverb and actually how the music sounds, and what that means in terms of world building. But yeah, also as a narrative agent, how music is used to tell the story, how it's used to kind of bring the plot forward at certain points, or to kind of illuminate certain narrative sort of moments, or to give a real insight into sort of character and characterization. And you're right that the use of sort of leitmotif, it's a kind of a sort of classical Hollywood sort of Wagnerian technique that lots of film composers use. And Howard Shore's interesting in his use of leitmotif, in that there are actually more themes for people groups, races or specific groups of people in the Lord of the Rings films than there are for individual characters. And I think that's why it's interesting, because that helps to grow the sense of the scale, I think, of the music and the scores and how they're interacting. So we don't necessarily have a Frodo theme, a Bilbo theme, a Samwise theme, but we do have a number of themes related to the Shire and to the Hobbits, and we have a number of themes related to Rohan, to Gondor, Mordor, Isengard, and actually all of these kind of interrelated sort of groups of agents or groups of people have their groups of themes. Yeah, I just love picking it apart. There's like small similarities and differences between, for example, the elves of Lothlorien, the elves of Rivendell, and kind of how they interrelate and overlap, but also how they're significantly different. That's less, I guess, prominent in this particular film. But even looking at the musicking of men and sort of comparing and contrasting the music for Rohan and for Gondor sort of brings up some really interesting things as well.
It seems to me as well that sound is not something that comes up as much when we think about the contribution. Well, when we think about fictional worlds as coherent, believable, authentic, not realistic, because they're fictional, but fictionally real spaces. but actually we don't really think about sound. Well, so is this true in terms of fictional writing on fictional world, thinking about fictional world across different media platforms? I know your work sort of embraces transmedia storytelling too. So I'm just wondering, certainly in the stuff that I've read and encountered, and maybe Alex in his research has uncovered bits, but my sense is that sound and music isn't something that comes to the forefront when we think about the cohesiveness of a fictional world. Is that fair? Is that a kind of good summation of where the state of the field is in relation to fictional worlds?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people working in the kind of the in-between spaces, and there's more and more work being done, obviously, not just on sort of music, but also, sound, in terms of kind of sound studies and how that interacts with cinema, fantasy media particularly. And so obviously I'm working in that space. Janet Harfyard has edited the Music of Fantasy Cinema book, which is great. And so, various collections are like that. And various other people, David Butler, working on sort of fantasy cinema, also talks about sound quite a bit, and music. So there's people kind of venturing into this space where I'm also finding myself and looking at, particularly music and sound. And I think the sort of diegetic or sort of like inside the world based sound is obviously kind of very carefully sort of tailored or recorded, or the use of Foley for specific sort of effect to give, Gandalf's staff a particular weight, or the sound of the horn that Gimli plays at the end. There's a lot of thought and detail gone into that, even sort of diegetic music. So the song which Éowyn sings at Theodred's funeral, which was composed by Plan 9, who basically composed all of the sort of diegetic music within the film, and she sings that, kind of a cappella. It's actually in sort of Old English, as a sort of a kind of a prehistory to sort of Rohan, and giving them that sense of archaism. So there's lots of thought obviously gone into the use of sound, as well as music to sort of tell the story. And it also, I mean, I could talk about this for a while. Also, with regards to the ring in its kind of physicality is also often given voice in all three films. And so each time the ring kind of appears, or if it starts to have a strong effect over Frodo or the ring racer around, you start to hear these kind of sort of eerie kind of whirring sounds, but you also hear a voice, whether that's a low male kind of black speech voice, or it's the Seduction of the Ring theme. One of the themes that the ring has is a sort of a boy treble singing. And it's this kind of luring sort of sound, this kind of siren, I suppose, kind of luring him to put it on his finger and to wield the power. So that kind of seduction, there's basically sort of sound used all the way kind of throughout to give us a bit of a window into Frodo's kind of subjective space as well. So quite often, if he's being affected by the ring or by any sort of like powers of darkness, as it were, quite often the sound is muffled or even sort of entirely removed in terms of kind of diegetic sound. So it puts us in the same sort of subjective space as Frodo, to kind of understand, I suppose, some of that, sort of mental turmoil or his kind of inner experience. So that was a long-winded answer to that question. About
long-winded is good. Long-winded is really interesting. Just because I always have trouble with the word realism. So, and also, always like to try and disagree with Chris as much as possible. So, just to trying to trouble that. So, if this is none of this sounds hyper-realistic. In fact, none of this sounds realistic to me. Both what the sounds you are describing and the way you are describing it. So, I just was curious. We often think of fictional worlds, or a lot of writing on fictional worlds worries about these ideas of sort of audio-visual credibility and logic and coherence. But sound, would you say sound is doing something a bit different in that sphere, or is it doing the same thing but in very different ways? Or the ability of sound to, I don't know, focus on emotion, to put us in subjective spaces, to engage in melody, in orchestration. There's lots that's very operatic and hyperbolic about this score. So, do you use that word realism? Do you think about it in terms of that kind of language, or would you push back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perhaps not necessarily a kind of a hyper-realism in the way that you've mentioned, but there's a kind of a cinematic realism. Obviously, there's sort of systems and tropes and expectations on behalf of the viewer and the listener, in terms of how the interplay between the three elements of the soundtrack. So music, whether that's diegetic or non-diegetic, dialogue, sound effects, and Foley, and how they kind of interrelate and interact as part of telling the story or building the world and moving things on, how they relate to the mise en scène and to different characters or situations and settings. And so, even sort of places and physical spaces, how sound is able to give a physical setting a sense of sort of realness. Maybe that's hyper realness. Maybe it's over exaggerating some of the realness. So an example that comes to mind, having just watched The Two Towers again, the moment when Eowyn sort of runs outside, and it's one of the first times we hear the Rohan theme on the Hardanger fiddle. The theme is very, very high in the mix. It's kind of, that's all we can hear. But we also hear very kind of over exaggerated the wind which rips the flag off the mast, off the flagpole. And maybe there's a sense there in which sound is being used to highlight this particular moment, not in a realistic sense, but maybe to bring about and to really emphasize it for the symbolic meaning, which is, that Rohan is in decline, and that she then obviously lays eyes on the three people sort of coming to Edoras and to help out a little bit. So I don't know, maybe there's a sense in which it's not hyper realism, maybe it's kind of an exaggeration for effect, a kind of a hyperbolic use of sound.
It puts us in,
perhaps,
it focuses the listener's attention on space, on the kind of the feel of the flag, things like that. So I guess, I don't know, Chris, I reckon you're going to have some things to say about this, but there's a synergy between that and what we might call kind of photorealism, right? Which is quite often films feel visually most realistic when the camera's presence is acknowledged and the mediating force of the camera is part, these things like Birdman or 1917, things like that, where the camera is almost an active agent in the film. They feel more realistic because the film feels filmed. So there's something similar going on in that both of those techniques are about acknowledging the role of mediation to anchor us in space, time, place, feeling, setting, things like that. I don't know, Chris, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, anchor, yes, but also to not, because presumably fantasy films have to work harder than perhaps other types of film genres, but types of film. Let's go with because of the what does a particular creature sound like, and you hear a lot about the production of these kinds of movies where they synthesize certain sounds to create the sound of a orc or the sound of a particular kind of creature or whatever it might be. So fantasy films have to work particularly hard, but they're also no more or no less fiction than 1917. They're both fiction films, but the way that fictionality is signalled is signalled in different ways. So I'm super interested in fictional worlds for these reasons, and because one can have realistic fiction and one can have fantasy fiction, but they are still fiction. And so that kind of acknowledgement of fictionality is something that really grounds a lot of fictional world theory. And the point is that it's trying to get us away from terms like realism, as you said, and more towards coherency, because a fantasy world can be absolutely unrealistic or non-realistic, but feel absolutely authentic and coherent. And in fact, this inadvertently leads on to something I was going to say about movement in relation to digital effects. And it's a line from, so I'll say the line and then I'll tie it back to what we're talking about. But Tom Gunning, in his article Moving Away from the Index, which cites Gollum as a particular example of the ways we should think about digital technology and almost get over the fact that it's not there in front of the camera, because there are other ways that it could read realistically. And he says, motion, therefore, need not be realistic to have a realistic effect. That is, to invite the empathic participation, both imaginative and physiological, of viewers. So I quite like the idea that something doesn't have to be realistic to have a realistic effect. And I feel that way about fantasy, and particularly kind of sound and music in these kinds of films.
To respond to some of that as well, and to go back to what you were saying about kind of realistic movement, I think I agree that fantasy often has to work harder in its kind of conjuring or building of a world and bringing us into it, because the step into it is more of a leap. It is more of there are more transitional processes required in order to bring us smoothly into a film world, a fantasy world where it is perhaps less familiar. There's more kind of world building to be done.
Yeah.
That is both, visual and through movement and editing, as well as it is through sound. At the same time, I think fantasy also affords the film the ability to play with some of those subjective spaces, because often in a fantasy space, flying isn't out of the picture, and so having kind of like vast kind of aerial shots, or for example, it could well be that we were being carried by the claws of an eagle at that point, on a big circling shot of Edoras or wherever we are. And so I think some of those kind of the ideas about the impossible subjective space, which I think is Zizek talks about, that actually in fantasy that allows us to kind of take a step in and say, yeah, okay, I can believe that this is also possible, and not even necessarily consciously. But I think some of the work that I've done on Lord of the Rings also looks at some of those kind of narrative breathing points, where music is perhaps foregrounded alongside like aerial shots of specific locations, as kind of a sort of a chapter divide, say, like move from one location to another, move from one part of the story to another part of the story in a different part of Middle Earth, and with this kind of aerial shot in between, with a lot of music, which is really foregrounded. And I think as an opportunity to sort of come out of the world and to go back into it, to allow yourself to kind of be decoupled momentarily, and then to re-enter. And I think it's that sort of cycle of suture and de-suture, really kind of being brought into a world and coming out of it. I think music and sound both play an important role in that, alongside some of the other sort of filmic sort of narrative agents as well.
But it seems like I'm really interested in that suture and de-suture, because it seems like, again, fantasy is just intensifying processes that kind of have to happen in. Alex is shaking his head, so
yeah, you're completely wrong. You're completely wrong.
Okay.
No, I really push back against this idea that all fantasy is doing is working harder than realistic fiction, because I think Dan is alluding to. Well, I think what you're alluding to there, and what speaks to me, is that yes, there are processes that are similar, and there are processes that are intensification, but there's an additional element to fantasy, which is about this is part of my argument, but the kind of the productive use of disbelief, actually part of the pleasure of going to see, we're talking about de-suturing and suturing. It's important also to, obviously this is the second movie, so actually when it's coming out, the audience has gone through a process of suturing and de-suturing, and that they've gone to see The Fellowship of the Ring a year ago. Was that a one-hit wonder, or is the whole trilogy going to work? Is it all going to be okay? In fact, the whole beginning of the movie kind of seems to offer a kind of Back to the Future Part 2-esque return to the film, through the kind of the fight with the Balrog we never got to see in the first movie. I think I don't quite know where music fits in with all this, because it's not something I've thought through very well. But I think there's also got to be, if the music is fantastic, like the audio, like the visuals are fantastic, then there's got to be an element by which the film is not necessarily requiring us to work harder to believe, but to use disbelief and transcendence and imagination in a different way that gives it its genre identity. Otherwise, what we're watching is King of Thieves or Top Gun Maverick. There is something about the contractual alignment between producer and spectator in a fantasy movie like this that says you're not going to believe this, and that's the pleasure in this. So
does that mean Top Gun Maverick isn't a fantasy film?
I haven't seen it, but the spectorial alignment I'm assuming the film asks of the spectator is not coherent with that. But I would have to, as I try to say in my own work, I don't know. I can't tell you how you feel about a movie, but if you feel like that about Top Gun Maverick, then it isn't a fantasy movie.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's a fantasy of something, whether it's a political fantasy or a military fantasy or a. But yeah. I suppose
now we're doing isn't live action a form of animation? Like we're doing that. We're doing that game.
I was thinking about your idea of kind of disbelief and this notion of the willing suspension of disbelief that occurs in all movies versus this issue of kind of intensification. Surely the issue is less disbelief and more the word willing, because you are. I like what Dan's saying about the kind of priming, and maybe it's less a fault of the film and more the way that fantasy is sold on the promise of certain kinds of not even genre tropes, but kind of experiences, and the leap, that the step isn't really a step, it's more of a leap, but within that leap there is a greater degree of tolerance to play with certain kinds of things. So it seems like music is mediating a lot of, and sound, but it's kind of mediating that transition into a fantasy film that is set up, that is made willing or unwilling, and that music's doing a lot of it performs. For me, it's kind of sonic equivalent of something like a map at the beginning of the fantasy film, or something, you know. And again, I know Alex has spoken at length about, you know, maps, so because obviously that's part of the world building. There's something that sound has to do, or maybe it's slightly different because this is the second film, as you said, Alex. It's kind of the second film of a trilogy that. And one of the things I really appreciated about the film, it was like, we're just going to assume you've sort of seen the first one, and we're going straight into it. And I was watching the first 10 minutes thinking, because I haven't seen the first one for a long time, and I was trying to figure out whether this is repeated footage, Back to the Future style, or whether it's refilmed footage, Back to the Future Part 2 style, or, you know, all these sorts of things about world building and stuff. So maybe it's slightly different because it's a fantasy film that's really embracing its franchise status as a second movie and just going with it. Anyway,
yeah, I think it's interesting because so Janet Harfyard, in her introduction to the music of fantasy cinema, she kind of identifies that really the Lord of the Rings trilogy is just one film, you know, having been shot at the same time, released year on year. Her way of sort of categorizing it as a grand epic fantasy is very much that actually that it's being told in 3 chapters, but in a similar way to the novel. It's one kind of long narrative. And yeah, I think because of that, the film's having to do a lot. It's basically, musically, it's picking up on a lot of themes that have already been established in the first film, and kind of assuming that you remember sort of some of what they mean. It does some reminding you of what they mean and what they represent, but it's picking up and expecting a kind of a vocabulary, a sort of a learned vocabulary and understanding or lexicon of some of these themes, and then introducing a whole bunch more. So over all 3 films, there's over 100 themes. It's about 110. Shout out to Doug Adams, who's written the book called The Music of the Lord of the Rings Films, which kind of catalogues these themes. And for anyone who wants a nice kind of weighty tome to flick through, then it's the perfect companion to watching, particularly the extended editions of the films. It kind of goes through page by page and tracks all the music. So over 100 themes, and there's a lot of them that are introduced pretty much in the second film. So by the end of the second film, you've got a head full of lots of different interrelated themes that are kind of bounding around. And to come back to what you said about the opening, you know, the very first moments of the film, it's having to do a lot. You're right. It's reminding the viewer of what's gone on at a specific moment previously. But even before that, so it opens with the Lord of the Rings title and the ring theme, the history of the ring theme. Before that, we've also got 16 bars of music, which it's setting the scene. It's not playing anything specifically thematic, but it is also using melodic material, which is very similar to Howard Shore's previous themes. It's also using harmonic shifts, which are kind of a part of the way in which he's already begun to kind of score certain parts of the world. So already the very first music that we hear is kind of recognizably Middle-earth, in a sense. I've written about this in a fairly cheesily titled article. One does not simply walk into Mordor. It's an article that looks at the music of the opening sequences of the Lord of the Rings films. In music, sound, and the moving image. And so picking apart those opening moments, for me, it's those moments that are absolutely paramount in the success of a film, in bringing us not only kind of straight into the action for the Two Towers, it takes us straight back, plunging through the snowy mountainside to where Gandalf's facing off against the Balrog. But the music already is reminding us exactly where and when in the action we are, sort of before we've even done that. There's also little sort of oral snippets and fragments of dialogue as well from the previous films. So like Gandalf, we hear even before we're kind of situated physically in the mountain, in the Mines of Moria. So there's various musical and sonic kind of things happening already to sort of bring us straight back into the world and remind us of whereabouts we are. So it's not just the kind of the Ring theme. But it's way more than that before and after in terms of what the music's doing. And for me, yeah, I think what's impressive and effective about this trilogy of films is the kind of the careful use of certain motifs or the careful use of certain musical ideas and instruments for very specific purposes, which to me just shows a degree of kind of care and detail that's gone into not only the scoring but also the ways in which the score is then employed in the film.
So just to sort of go through some of the kind of more, I don't know, practical concerns of the movie. So we've talked a lot about its kind of general, how does it sound like a fantasy, and we've talked about kind of ideas of entering the world and things. Let's talk about, like, you know, some of the ways in which this bears out in the movie itself. So one of the key jobs, we're talking about world building, is that the film is expanding the narrative. The narrative is getting more complicated. Characters are splintering often around. So there's new nations to introduce. There's new races to introduce. Rohan, right, being a key one. Perhaps we should start with that one. How is the world of Rohan depicted musically to help set up this kind of whole culture that this movie in particular seems to rely on us engaging with and embracing and identifying with slightly, as we're sort of meant to be there in Helm's Deep at the end, waiting for this onslaught of orcs. And then I have a question about kind of how this all ties back to the other stuff. But let's start with what's new about the movie, you know.
You're absolutely right. I think this film, it pivots around the kind of the fate of Rohan, because kind of the fate of Middle-earth is kind of pinned upon the fate of Rohan also as part of the kind of the narrative thrust of it. And so Rohan and their themes are, I think, really central. They're actually, so this is my favorite of the three films, and the Rohan sort of music is my favorite part of any of Shaw's soundtracks. So there's one sort of key sort of theme, the Rohan fanfare. I should have prepared kind of musical examples so I don't have to sing so much. So there's the Rohan fanfare, and I mean, it's got this kind of, quite often it's quite a rousing sort of upward movement. It's got horns, it's very brassy, but it also has some iterations where it's more kind of fragile. The first few times we hear it, and I mentioned it earlier, when Éowyn sort of runs outside and it's all windy and kind of grey, and the flag blows off. And we hear it on the instrument called a hardanger fiddle, which is actually, it's kind of a variation on a violin or fiddle, that has what we call sympathetic strings that lie underneath the fingerboard, so that they're playing sort of strings in a similar way to a violin, but there's other strings that are vibrating and giving extra resonance. So this is kind of extra kind of resonance, sort of like folk sort of style instrument. And it's actually a kind of a Norwegian, or at least sort of like Northern European traditional folk instrument, which I think pairs up with the kind of Norse, kind of Viking-esque kind of Norse mythology that surrounds the way in which Peter Jackson paints, and also Tolkien paints, Rohan, and giving it that sort of musical logic. So even though it's, you know, we're thinking about something which is entirely fantastical, it's embedding it within and anchoring it within what is recognizable to us to an extent. Not to say that everyone will recognize that sound and be like, that's a hardanger fiddle, I know that. Although some might. Also, Bear McCreary has made significant use of the hardanger fiddle in his work on the Rings of Power. So it does come back, which is quite nice, in another kind of race of men that might be a sort of a predisposition to Rohan. But anyway, I think the music of Rohan is really interesting because of that the sounds, the instruments that are used. And actually the first time that we hear the fanfare in the kind of full brass, the kind of really bold, brassy version of this fanfare, is actually immediately after the kind of exorcism of Theoden King. So when he's still sort of under the control of Saruman and looking very, very old, with cataracts and things, we only hear the Rohan fanfare in kind of a solo instrument, and it's more solemn and melancholic, whereas immediately after he sort of becomes himself again, we hear this huge horns and brass kind of iteration of it. And so even the orchestration, even the ways in which the themes are used, is significant. And what I also think is interesting is that looking through the different themes that Howard Shaw's creates, and actually Doug Adams relates 3 of the 4 kind of Rohan themes to Éowyn. So she has her own kind of little theme. There's a theme composed specifically for Éowyn and Theoden. and there's a theme specifically for Éowyn and Aragorn and their relationship, which I think is interesting because I think it provides a different sort of angle. You know, watching either the cinematic release or the extended edition, Éowyn is a character, but for me watching it, she's not necessarily the central character for Rohan. I think we're watching a group of different people interrelate with the Fellowship. But I think musically what Howard Shore is doing is he's positioning us kind of empathically. I think it's interesting how Howard Shore kind of positions us empathically alongside Éowyn and some of the tensions that she feels in the ways that she relates to the other characters and what's going on. That actually, emotionally, for Howard Shore, Éowyn is the crux and the central part of what's happening in Rohan. Which I suppose makes sense when she comes to save the day somewhat in Return of the King later on, and ends up quite nicely with Faramir, which is always nice. Spoiler alert for whenever you do the Return of the King. So yeah, I think that's interesting for Rohan and the music. Yeah.
What's interesting is that maybe this is just a practical thing. Is that you said at the beginning, and I made a note to come back to it. It sounded really interesting that the scoring focuses on groups of peoples and races in particular, and we're going to definitely come to that word in a minute. But we'll leave that for now because we've got an equally difficult thing to think about, which is gender. So these films are notoriously trying to write a tightrope in that there's basically no women in other than passing references in Tolkien's original novels, and the films work hard to try to give the women that are mentioned in the books more time, presence, agency for both altruistic and reasons of commerce. So the women are very often individuals because there aren't many of them. We have Éowyn and we have Arwen, and sort of that's about it. But it sounds like those women are individualized within the score in the way that the male characters are often not, which is an interesting little paradox about what we might say about the role, music contributes to the representation of gender in the film. So I don't know if there's any more you have to say about that, but I just noticed it in your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting. And I think maybe that's either a conscious or subconscious part of the effort to kind of bolster the presence of the female within the film in a film, which is, like you say, is largely sort of male dominated in character and the power of some of those characters and the weight of what they bring to the narrative. So yeah, I do think it's really interesting because having Éowyn musically as that character, and like you said, Arwen also has a theme of her own. She has a song. She also has a moment where she sings. So Liv Tyler sings The Houses of Healing, which is in the final film, I believe, The Return of the King.
It might even only be an extended cut, but hey, I don't even know how they're related.
Yes, I think you're right. I do think you're right. Yeah, and it is interesting to see, specifically kind of female characters being given their own themes, but those themes are sort of, not necessarily the most kind of triumphant heroic themes. Again, there are heroic moments in the ways in which Shaw uses Éowyn's music, as she is a hero or heroine. She does join the battle, and obviously she kind of she wields a sword pretty in a strong way in the final film. The exception, I think, is Galadriel, which is interesting in that Galadriel doesn't have her own theme throughout. She appears once in the Two Towers, at the point where she's sort of speaking telepathically to Elrond, and at that point we have the Lothlorien theme, which is her kind of group of elves, the ones in the woods that are a bit more mysterious, not quite sure whose side they're on when we first meet them. And so that's the one. Well, that's the one moment. That's the first moment that the Lothlorien theme is heard alongside Galadriel, and so they're kind of one and the same in a sense, that group of elves and Galadriel. And then later on, a group of elves arrive at Helm's Deep, and we hear the Lothlorien theme in full kind of battle armor, in a way that we've not heard it before. So yeah, in terms of gender in the film, I think it's quite interesting. Generally, the use of voice is all largely female as well. So the use of kind of voice and vocality by Howard Shore, there are some male voices for orcs and dwarves and what have you. But for elves and all of the kind of soloists, the majority of the vocal soloists, of which Howard Shore uses many, all tend to be female voices. And if we look at the credit songs as well, so Emiliana Torini, who gives the credit song for The Two Towers, and then the first credit song is Enya, the third credit song is Annie Lennox. So three very, very strong kind of almost instantly recognizable specific female voices that are, again, I think part of the use of female voice throughout all three of the scores, I think is significant. And what does that mean? Maybe it's kind of pairing with some of the angelic sort of connotations of the elves, particularly because the elves, whether in Rivendell or Lothlorien, are generally accompanied by kind of female choir or female voice in some way.
Interesting. I mean, we have colleagues like Rebecca Harrison, who does stuff on like Star Wars, where these really interesting empirical data on screen time of women in various movies. And I think to add to that and to continue this conversation, it'd be really interesting to do like sound time for different characters in a film like this to see if there's any discrepancy or it goes along similar lines.
I'd like to. I'm going to jump in with a question about the ambivalent nature, because you said, well. Dan, you said that it's your favourite of the three. Alex, did you say it was your favourite of the three, or that you just really liked?
No, it's my favourite of the three. Yeah, it's my favourite of the three.
But you also said at the start that it's quite divisive. So in terms of fantasy storytelling, perhaps, or because I'm thinking about, as I often am, the film's year of release. So it's kind of 2002-ness, which is, I think, super important. Looking at having just written a chapter on Die Another Day, historically one of the worst Bond films from 2002, and the kind of
the best theme, right? Best theme.
Let's not. We'll get you back.
We
on
have
that
a colleague
podcast.
that thinks that's going to be dining out that you just said that, Dan, for years.
Sure. But the kind of 2002-ness, if thinking about, I think Die Another Day was sort of number 6 in the top grossing films of the year, and all of the others are these kinds of fantasy movies or space fantasy. So Attack of the Clones, I think the second or third Men in Black, perhaps, and Lord of the Rings, Two Towers. But I'm just sort of this is coming at a time, presumably, Alex, where fantasy film is back on some kind of agenda, but at the same time, did it do well? Did it not do well? You said it's divisive. Is that purely for Tolkien-esque fans, or is it what's going on?
Dad, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you're more immersed in fan studies than I am. But my perception is it did very well commercially, and it did well critically. I think fans generally liked it. I think thinking about the trilogy and playing the game of which is the best, it doesn't often come out on top.
Right.
I think the main criticism is the classic structural problem of the second act movie, which is you sort of know where you start and you sort of know when you end, and yet you've got to watch 2.5 hours of it. But that said, I think the Helm's Deep sequence is still often seen as one of the best of the whole trilogy, but it's whether the stuff before it kind of justifies its stuff. I think perhaps because they had to work harder to make the film have stakes and they had to work. I think they, by their own admission, they worked the hardest on this one to kind of get it into shape because it didn't have a natural beginning and end. To me, the filmmaking is all the richer for it. But people don't always like it as much.
The reason I was thinking about it is because going back to what Dan said around sort of communities and different characters that are always singular, characters that are always in pairs, groups of characters, and how that might kind of reflect in some of the sound arrangements. But what struck me about, I guess, a lot of the film, if not all of the film, but certainly I saw the nearly 3-hour version. No idea if that's the...
No, that's the
extended,
nice trim
just the
theatrical
normal
cut.
Sure, yeah, sure. Just I thought it breezed past as I was watching. But the different way that you've essentially got 3 different movies that are almost 3 different genres. You've got a sort of a buddy cop kind of comedy between Merry and Pippin, where they're basically being carried by a big tree, and then you've got a more sort of straight fantasy. Well, I guess the other 2 are kind of more straight fantasies, where you have Frodo and Sam with Gollum, but I think that's doing something different because that's more that seems to be more character based rather than action based. And then even though Gollum is a special effect, there seems to be something about the relationship between all 3 characters, and actually in particular what Gollum does to the relationship between Frodo and Sam. I thought that was really interesting, and what that does to their levels of trust between them that obviously is set up in the first film. Look at me talking confidently about Lord of the Rings, Alex. Look at this. Well and then the sort of more straight fantasy, I think, is the Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli and Gandalf narrative. even though I don't think Orlando Bloom can act, but maybe that's something for another podcast. He falls in my category of people that are pretty to look at but can't act. So
I don't think anyone
Clive
thinks. Does anyone think Orlando?
Okay, good.
He can skateboard. He can skateboard and he can shoot
sure.
arrows, but I'm not sure he can act.
I had a question exactly on that point about Gollum. So if we say, or if I make a claim that fantasy movies have to work harder, okay, in terms of a character like Gollum, then. And the Gollum theme, if I assume that there is one, and I'm sure you'll do it for us in a minute. But the sort of, is there a difference when scoring? And I don't mean the sound that Gollum makes, which as a 3-dimensional physical or physicalized character that is voiced by Andy Serkis and is whose movement is provided by Andy Serkis, but I more mean the soundtrack, the way in which does the soundtrack have to do something different when it's trying to ground a digital character that audiences know aren't there or aren't pro-filmic, let's say, versus when they're scoring. You said Galadriel doesn't have her own theme, so Liv Tyler, Arwen's kind of thing, is that's doing something different because she is a real person. So I just wondered, is that kind of relationship reflected, or is that their fluctuating levels of immateriality, let's say, is that reflected in the soundtrack at all?
It's really interesting, and it's not something that I've thought of much before in terms of Gollum and his sense of materiality or not, and how physical we're supposed to feel him. I mean, the things that he does they give him that sense of physicality. Yep. You know, the idea of like biting into a live fish, and all of the kind of the close-ups that we see, even of his eyes, that's in the beginning of Return of the King. You know, things like that make us say, okay, yeah, he is so physical and real. And I think musically, it's not that the music for Gollum, and interestingly, there's two themes, you might imagine, in his kind of like two personalities.
An extended theme, a theatrical theme, a made-for-TV theme, whatever, the DVD theme.
Yeah, exactly. The hidden theme.
But yes, the Schmiegel Gollum distinction.
Exactly. Well. That kind of dual personality of element to the character is also musicalized. So there's one which Doug Adams or Howard Shore referred to as the pity of Gollum, and one that's referred to as the menace or Gollum's menace. And so there's one which is more kind of Schmiegel's theme, one that's more Gollum's theme. I won't sing those for you. They're quite chromatic and hard to sing, so you'll have to go and find out yourself. But what's interesting is that I don't think they're doing anything which is trying to make him seem more physical in a sense, but I think they're both kind of full of, well, at least the pity of Gollum is full of a kind of sorrow, a sense of kind of twistedness and a bit of brokenness in terms of the chromaticism and kind of some of the chords that it moves between, some of the harmonic progressions. So all that, I think that musically he's trying to portray him as a twisted version of a hobbit, basically, which is what he is. He's not a hobbit per se. I forget exactly what kind of...
No. Yes, some sort of hobbity thing that probably is in the Rings of Power.
Exactly. He's sort of a derivation of a sort of a halfling folk. And so 500 years have being spent with the ring sort of tormenting him. He has twisted him into this kind of creature that he is. And so I think musically, what Howard Shore is trying to do, particularly with the pity of Gollum theme, is kind of wrap around these kind of sinewy kind of hairs of the theme which enact on us in a way which is, he's kind of creepy, but do we sort of pity him? And I think emotionally that also plays with what happens for Gollum in this entire film, which is, do we sort of pity him? Is he actually treacherous? Or do we feel a bit sorry for his scenario and the power that the ring has kind of held over him? And that's the journey that Frodo goes on as well, which is one of sort of starting to pity him, because Frodo starts to understand and experience a little bit of what he's been through. So I think musically it is quite interesting. There's one final theme as well, another Gollum theme, which is the song, the credit song that comes over the end credits, sung by Emiliana Torrini. And that's quite interesting because it kind of smooths over the closing sequence. The very end of the film is kind of Frodo and Samwise kind of talking about where they're going and Gollum agreeing to lead them to Mordor. And then we see this kind of the return of Gollum, as opposed to Smeagol saying, "Oh, we could let her do it." Dum dum dum. And it's at that point that we start to hear the music of Gollum's song for a good minute before the song sort of is sung by Emiliano Torrini over the end credits. And again, it just smooths over the end of the film as the camera kind of moves up and we see Mordor in the distance, which I think is also a key part of it being the middle film, the kind of the second of three, that musically is trying to give us an ending, but not an abrupt, this is the end ending, a smoother transition into the credits, which I think also enables a continued kind of inhabitation of that world. It's not saying, right, it's finished, get out, but it's saying this film is finishing. And I think the end credits, as the films are long, the credits for the films are very long. In fact, the end credits for the extended edition of Return of the King is, I think, 26 or 28 minutes of credits, which is amazing. And musically, for me, that does something interesting as well, because it leaves it very much up to the viewer to decide when they want to, I suppose, imaginatively leave the world. It's continuing to build the world and say it's still here if you want to, if you want to just perceive and consider and reflect on the film, reflect on the world. But then again, that's something which is being undone by Netflix and other streaming services when they say, it's finished, watch this now. Don't watch the credits and you have to opt into them. I'm sure you've maybe discussed that before, but the end credits and particularly kind of Gollum as one of the central figures musically, the themes also start to twist into the Ring theme and into some of the Mordor themes as well. So there are, again, really interesting interrelations between Gollum's themes and some of the other ones that show the effect of the Ring and the effect of, I suppose, Mordor and Sauron on Gollum.
It's realistically.
I have one more topic that I'd like us to cover before we sort of say our
goodbyes.
Race? But yes, which is race. I think it's important because I'm not sure we'll do justice to it in the time we've got left, but or indeed if we had all the time in the world. But yes. So we've mentioned some buzzwords that are probably worth pulling together and having a chat about, which is, Dan, you've made the point which I hadn't thought about, but it's a really good one, that a lot of the motifs are linked to race and different, whether it's the Rohans versus Gondorians, but also I'm assuming the orcs have a theme, the Uruk-hai have a theme, all this kind of stuff. We've mentioned Wagner, and I know I know Howard Shaw has mentioned this kind of his this could be his opportunity to write a kind of Wagnerian opera, right? So and I know obviously Tolkien, and there's books on this. I think Susan Young's Race in Fantasy Literature is a really good one that talks about kind of the racist structure of something like Lord of the Rings, in that what gives a character moral worth is usually defined by race rather than by characters. At least that's true of the bad characters. I'm not quite sure that's always true of the humans in particular, but certainly elves have a certain quality, hobbits have a certain quality, orcs certainly have a certain quality. So, race, music, Dan, what is there to say more? But obviously there's something tricky and problematic going on that we could unpack here, or is there?
I mean, yeah, there is. I suppose race per se is, with regards to kind of Lord of the Rings, something that I've not kept at arm's length, but I haven't sort of like dived straight into. I do think it's interesting. What I like and appreciate is that there are kind of relations, as I've said, between kind of elves. So it's not like all elves have the same music, but there are sort of instrumentational or vocal similarities between the music of the different elves. Similarly, there's also the use of similar intervals in music theory. So a minor sixth, which is features heavily in Lothlorien, Rivendell, and then also in The Hobbit, Tauriel, and some of the other kind of elven characters that kind of continue. And so there's some quite pleasing kind of sort of links, and again, sort of things between like the Uruk-hai for Isengard all being in 5/4, and some of these kind of minor stepwise movements in the Uruk-hai, and also the orcs and some of the Mordor and Ringwraith sort of things. There are sort of quite pleasing links, which for what Jason Mittell would call the forensic fan, the forensic viewer, or for me, forensic listener, if you dig in, there are these kind of pleasing links, which I think link to this sense of sort of grand epic scoring. But in terms of race, I mean, the thing that does come to mind is some of the music for the Hobbits And some of the kind of, I suppose, more the idea not of race, but of sort of nationality and national folk musics, and some of the music by Plan 9 being this kind of cod Celtic sort of folk, everything for the hobbits. And I suppose this is more relating to the Fellowship of the Ring, but what we have, diegetic music for the hobbits and their parties and things, is all of these hurdy-gurdies and mouth organs and Jews harps and things like this, where there's a kind of a shorthand which could be deemed sort of lazy. Whereas is Peter Jackson trying to depict the hobbits as Irish or Celtic or Scottish in this kind of countryside, which is it supposed to be New Zealander, or is it supposed to be this kind of bucolic English sort of stereotypical kind of view? And how does that work for national and transnational audiences as well? Martin Barker did some absolutely fantastic work, obviously, on the audience reception, and particularly kind of national audiences for Lord of the Rings. And what interests me is I dug into some of his databases, actually, and was looking for mentions of music and how people thought about and responded to the music of those three films, related to their kind of nationality and what have you. And that was a while ago, so I can't remember the kind of interesting things that I did find. But yeah, I find that interesting to think about what are some of the representations within music where there is a clear shorthand to, is this a kind of a Celtic culture which is being referenced, and if so, why, and is that effective, or is it, what's it doing there?
Interesting questions. Chris, do you have
no, because I was thinking about orcs, and I wrote down as part of my notes, I wrote down the idea of kind of orcs as indigenous communities, and I was thinking about who owns the land, essentially, especially in New Zealand, a place like New Zealand, and the way that the film maybe doesn't define whiteness, but defines non-whiteness or blackness in the case of the orcs. But thinking about the role of indigenous communities, and given how this film is about moving through land and moving through space, and then obviously the battle at the end is about protecting one's land, and the whole overarching narrative of Saruman's art and all this sort of stuff, the eye that looks over the space. I was just thinking about this, essentially thinking about locality, both in relation to the production of these films and its New Zealandness again, but also local knowledge, who owns the land, who the land belongs to, and how that fits in with a depiction of the Uruk-hai, and given if one would represent or think about representing them as non-white bodies, what that then says about them and their relationship to the land, if they are the sacrificial community. I don't know. There's just something around. I was just thinking about indigenous communities and pushing it beyond Orientalism to think about their relationship to the land, and what this army of essentially white bodies who have flown to New Zealand. I don't know. There's just something provocative about that I don't have the answer to.
There's a way of reading this entire story as Tolkien describes it as kind of faux history, as a kind of faux white supremacist history, where actually it's because the orcs are colonizers in this movie, just sort of narratively speaking. So there is a way of reading this entire movie as kind of white supremacist alternative history, where it's actually the white people that get colonized rather than
white people are the victims at last.
Yeah, exactly. Right, okay. My only 2 cents on this, and it's a question I've said on the podcast without an answer to, and I don't have an answer to it today. I'm trying to think through issues of ethics and representation in relationship to fantasy in my own work, and I haven't got a good answer to it yet. But my only question to pose is that this is why I was keen to push back on ideas of believability, because I think this is key. Is that if a film has an ideological power, then that's because the fantasy involved in ideology is used to affirm a truth or a believed truth or a perceived truth. So if we believe a fantasy film, if the fantasy is believable, then its ideological power becomes effective and therefore problematic if we're reading it in these terms. If we don't believe the fantasy, if the fantasy is there to be disbelieved, that's a very different spectatorial relationship. And I'm not saying that, I'm not posing this question to therefore say fantasy films can't be racist. I'm just saying if they are racist, they're racist in slightly different terms to a realist film, because the their ideological effect is achieved through their ability to evoke imagination and disbelief rather than their ability to evoke belief. So if an orc is racist, it's also impossibly racist, and I'm not sure what we do with that, what the answer to that question is. It might make them even worse, but I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with the idea that you can just map representation as you would in a mimetic drama onto something like this, and it works the same.
And I think to bring that into back to the kind of like musical frame as well, there's a sense in which, I mean, there's a sort of necessity, well, not a necessity, but part of the expectations of kind of the scoring of a Western blockbuster is to use, like, you know, a symphonic orchestra and orchestral instruments, and those instruments are deemed kind of familiar and effective, and they each have their own sort of connotations that they bring with them from centuries of representative history. But then it means that Howard Shore, when he wants to music something which is other, there is an othering and exoticism for both kind of the elves and also for Mordor, or I forget what they're called, the kind of Eastern sort of men, the men from the East who come and help Mordor. So the elves, there are some kind of like Eastern instruments. I think it's a sarangi, which is used kind of like a bowed instruments from Indian classical music, which is used for some of the elf music, and some other kind of end blown flutes. And then for the kind of the Eastern men, I forget what they're called. Again, a kind of a bowed sitar. There's a writer, which is a horn used in Mordor, and so each of these instruments, which are kind of Eastern in origin, being used to kind of for very clearly sort of exoticist purposes. And yeah, some of that doesn't necessarily sit all that well with me, because it's catering for a very specific audience and listenership, to say these things that you can hear, these are the bad guys. Oh, and also they are all sort of instruments from the Middle East or Asia. So,
and presumably there's a kind of contribution of visual effects here, because in relation to the kinds of bodies that fantasy films choose to hide, augment, or keep as they are. So Aragorn looks like Viggo Mortensen. There's no extra bit to him that hides his white masculinity. There are, however, certain bodies in the film that the certain bodies that the film chooses to hide or to refigure in ways that perhaps. So I guess the point here is that in an age where everybody occupies different proximities to humanity. Human is not a category that is afforded to everybody, because communities are fighting for their lives to matter. Communities are fighting to not be called cockroaches and all these kinds of derogatory terms. So in an era when everybody's proximity to humanity is very, very different and varies wildly from country to country, or neighborhood to neighborhood, fantasy in its register of making foreign and making alien versus preserving human has to take on different, because fantasy cinema through its visual effects is making discriminations about people's proximity to a recognizable humanity, because it's saying we're going to keep Viggo Mortensen as he is, because Alex, you mentioned commerce earlier, because he's a handsome man that will look good in the middle of a poster, and actually that is and Liv Tyler, and you know, there's discriminations that are being made about beauty and glamour that are highly racialized versus the kinds of bodies that are hidden behind prosthetics or that are even made to look like non-white bodies. So I think that fantasy's use of special effects and visual effects sort of feeds into a broader discourse of how humanity is not a category that is afforded to everybody, because that is played out visually in fantasy films all the time.
Yeah, okay. I think we're going to have to leave the listeners with lots of different thoughts there. Maybe we can return to it. Well, I'm sure we will at some point.
We'll do an extended cut, Alex, and then we'll for the DVD. One for the DVD.
Just as long as there's more songs, because I've really enjoyed thinking about it in terms of sound. I'm sure we skimmed the surface there, but I think I've learned a lot, so I'm sure listeners did too. So Dan, this is part of a wider book project that's currently sort of ongoing / near to completion, is it? So just tell us a little bit about that before we go, so that listeners can be primed to purchase it when it's available.
Yeah. So it's a book that basically it kind of is bringing together some of my work on the franchises of Lord of the Rings, including The Hobbit and Rings of Power, and Harry Potter, including Fantastic Beasts. And then so it looks at film and starts off, its first 3 chapters are based in film, and then the last 3 chapters look at kind of transmedia. So theme parks, trailers, video games, plays, fandom, particularly, and kind of tourism. And so, it's focusing a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, kind of musical world building, and the central idea of home, and actually the reason that perhaps fantasy and the way that music works in these fantasy franchises is by creating a recognizable and an inhabitable sense of home that keeps people coming back. And Hogwarts Legacy has just come out a couple of weeks ago, and people are still, some people are still kind of flocking to it to kind of inhabit it. So it might be called something like Sounds Like Home. It's going to be in the Ashgate Screen Music series, perhaps later this year, so 2023. Hopefully, we'll see.
Right. We'll keep an eye out for that and make sure it gets on our reading lists and everyone else on their reading lists. Terrific. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting Two Towers with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had a very, very great time. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, ditto, absolutely. Really great to revisit the movie and really enjoyed to do it that way. Like the film itself, we went straight in without catching you up there. But if listeners would want to catch up on the Fellowship of the Ring, that's in our archive. You can access it at fantasy-animation.org. If you've got anything to say about any of the things we've raised, you can contact us via the Contact Us forum or at our email address, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and you can use the same handle to find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, as long as tech conglomerates keep it that way. Otherwise, that's been us for an episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.